Yes, my neighbor really did poison my beloved dog, Copper, because of some early morning barking. And yes, I really did turn his perfect lawn into his worst nightmare using my landscaping expertise. But what I haven't told you yet is that when I secretly contaminated his irrigation system with a special plant extract, his skin became so grotesquely swollen and disfigured that he fell screaming onto his own lawn and was rushed to the hospital. But before I tell you exactly what happened that day, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of the incredible stories we tell here. Have you subscribed yet? Now let me tell you. My name is Marina, and until 6 months ago, I thought I was living the American dream in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. At 42, I had finally found peace after my divorce 3 years earlier. My landscape design business was thriving. My little craftsman house was exactly what I'd always wanted, and I had the best companion anyone could ask for. Copper, my 4-year-old golden retriever who'd been with me through the darkest days of my life. Every morning, we'd start our day the same way. I'd sip my coffee on the back porch while Copper did his morning patrol of our fenced yard, occasionally letting out a few happy barks at the squirrels or the neighbor's cat. It was our routine, our moment of peace before the day began. I thought it was harmless enough. Just a few barks between 7 and 7:30 a.m., nothing that would disturb anyone in our quiet suburban neighborhood. But I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about a lot of things when it came to my neighbor Vincent Holloway. Vincent lived in the house directly behind mine, separated only by a 6-foot wooden fence that ran along our property line. From day one, it was clear that Vincent was what you might call a particular person. His house was painted a pristine shade of cream with navy blue shutters, not a single chip or fade mark anywhere. His driveway was always spotless, his car always gleaming, and his front yard looked like it belonged in a magazine. But it was his backyard that was truly his masterpiece, a lawn so perfect it didn't look real. Every blade of grass was exactly the same height. The edges were cut with mathematical precision, and there wasn't a single weed, dead spot, or imperfection anywhere. I'd often see him out there with various tools and sprays, maintaining his green paradise with the dedication of a museum curator. At first, I admired his dedication. There's something to be said for taking pride in your property, and Vincent clearly took enormous pride in his. I even complimented him on it once when we happened to be outside at the same time, though his response was more of a grunt than actual conversation. The problem started about 2 months after I moved in. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was enjoying my usual coffee ritual when Vincent appeared at our shared fence. He was dressed in his typical weekend uniform, pressed khakis, a polo shirt that looked like it had just come from the dry cleaner, and spotless white sneakers. His dark hair was perfectly combed, and even from 20 feet away, I could see that his mustache was trimmed with ruler-like precision. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone that people use when they're trying to sound polite but are actually annoyed. I walked over with Copper trotting beside me, tail wagging because he was always happy to meet new people. "Good morning, Vincent," I said, genuinely pleased to have a chance for a neighborly chat. How's everything going?" His eyes immediately went to Copper, and I noticed the way his jaw tightened. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about your dog," he said, gesturing toward Copper with obvious distaste. "The barking in the mornings has become quite disruptive to my routine." I was genuinely surprised because Copper really didn't bark that much, and when he did, it was never for long periods. I apologized immediately and explained that Copper was just excited about the morning and usually only barked for a few minutes. "I understand that any noise can be bothersome," I said, trying to be as considerate as possible. "Would it help if I brought him inside a little earlier in the mornings?" Vincent's expression didn't soften at all. If anything, he seemed more irritated that I hadn't immediately offered to solve the problem permanently. "The thing is," he continued, "I work very hard to maintain a peaceful environment on my property. I have important calls to make in the mornings, and I can't have random barking disrupting my concentration." The way he said random barking made it sound like Copper was some kind of neighborhood menace rather than a friendly dog enjoying his own backyard. I assured him that I would work on the issue and asked if there were specific times that would be better or worse for letting Copper outside. Vincent looked at me like I was missing something obvious. Ideally, he said slowly, there would be no barking at all. Ever. That's when I realized that this conversation wasn't really about finding a compromise. It was about Vincent wanting total control over every sound in his environment. Over the next few weeks, I did everything I could to minimize Copper's morning barking. I started bringing him in as soon as he made any noise. I bought him new toys to keep him occupied, and I even rearranged my own schedule to spend more time with him in the front yard instead. But it quickly became clear that nothing I did would satisfy Vincent. He started appearing at the fence every time Copper so much as whimpered, armed with a small notebook where he would ostentatiously write down the time and duration of each air incident. He began timing the barking with a stopwatch, as if he were collecting evidence for some kind of legal proceeding. When I'd wave and try to acknowledge his presence in a friendly way, he would just stare at me with this cold, measuring look before turning around and walking back to his house. The whole situation was making me increasingly uncomfortable, but I kept telling myself that he was probably just stressed about work or dealing with some other issue that was making him extra sensitive to noise. I wanted to believe that we could work it out like reasonable adults. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in late September. I had been extra careful about keeping Copper quiet, but he spotted a rabbit in our yard and let out exactly 3 barks before I called him inside. 3 barks, maybe 5 seconds total. I was still in my pajamas when Vincent appeared at the fence, practically vibrating with rage. "This is completely unacceptable," he announced, his voice loud enough that I was sure other neighbors could hear him. "I have been more than patient with this situation, but clearly you have no intention of controlling your animal." The word animal came out like he was talking about a wild beast rather than a gentle golden retriever. I tried to explain that I was doing my best and that 3 barks hardly seemed worth getting upset about, but Vincent cut me off. "I don't think you understand the situation," he said, his voice dropping to something that was almost threatening. "This is affecting my quality of life, and I will not tolerate it any longer." There was something in his tone that made me genuinely worried for the first time. This wasn't just about noise. This was about a man who needed absolute control and saw my dog as an obstacle to that control. After that confrontation, I started paying closer attention to Vincent's behavior, and what I saw made me increasingly uneasy. He had security cameras pointed in every direction around his property, including some that seemed to be focused on the fence line we shared. He spent hours every day working on his lawn with an intensity that seemed almost obsessive, measuring and remeasuring, adjusting sprinkler heads by fractions of inches, and testing the soil with various instruments. I began to notice that he kept detailed logs of everything, not just Copper's barking, but the weather, the condition of his grass, the timing of his watering schedule, even the activities of other neighbors. When the mail carrier was a few minutes late, Vincent would be waiting at the curb, tapping his watch. When the garbage truck made any noise beyond the absolute minimum required to do their job, Vincent would emerge from his house with that same notebook, writing everything down. This was a man who believed that the entire world should operate according to his specifications, and anyone who disrupted that perfect order was an enemy to be eliminated. I had no idea how far he was willing to go to eliminate what he saw as problems. Chapter 2. The Unthinkable Loss. October 15th started like any other Tuesday. I woke up early, made my coffee, and let Copper out into the backyard for his morning routine. He was particularly energetic that day, practically bouncing with excitement as he explored his familiar territory. I watched him through the kitchen window as I prepared my breakfast, smiling at the way his golden fur caught the early morning sunlight. He sniffed around his favorite spots, chased a few falling leaves, and then settled near his water bowl for a drink. Everything seemed perfectly normal, exactly the way thousands of other mornings had gone before. I had no reason to think that this day would be any different. no warning that my world was about to collapse in the most devastating way possible. When I left for work that morning, Copper was napping contentedly in his favorite sunny spot by the back door. I scratched behind his ears, told him I'd be back by lunch to check on him, and headed out to a consultation with a new client about their garden renovation project. It was supposed to be a good day. I was excited about the project and looking forward to coming home to my furry best friend who would greet me at the door with his usual enthusiasm. I returned home around 1 p.m., already calling Copper's name as I unlocked the front door. Usually, he would come running the moment he heard my car in the driveway, but today there was only silence. "Copper!" I called out, walking through the house toward the back door. "Where are you, buddy?" When I stepped onto the back porch, I saw him immediately, and my heart stopped. He was lying on his side near the fence line, completely motionless. Even from a distance, I could tell something was terribly wrong. His body was rigid in a way that sleep never looked, and there was a strange foam around his mouth that made my stomach clench with fear. I ran to him, dropping to my knees and placing my hands on his chest, desperately hoping to feel some sign of life. But Copper was gone. His eyes were open, but vacant. His tongue was hanging out of his mouth, and his body was already growing cold. I had never experienced pain like what hit me in that moment. It was physical, like someone had reached into my chest and torn out my heart. I held him and cried until I couldn't breathe, unable to accept that my loyal companion was really gone. When I finally managed to compose myself enough to think clearly, I called my veterinarian's emergency line, Dr. Patricia Reeves had been Copper's vet since I adopted him, and she agreed to come to my house to examine him rather than making me transport his body. When she arrived 20 minutes later, I was still sitting on the ground next to Copper, stroking his fur and trying to understand what could have happened. Dr. Reeves was gentle but thorough in her examination, and her expression grew increasingly grim as she worked. "Marina," she said finally, "I'm very sorry, but based on what I'm seeing here, the foam around his mouth, the way his body is positioned, the smell I'm detecting, I believe Copper was poisoned." The word hit me like a physical blow. "Poisoned?" I repeated, unable to process what she was telling me. "How is that possible? He never leaves the yard. I'm so careful about what he eats." Dr. Reeves explained that the symptoms were consistent with antifreeze poisoning, which unfortunately happened more often than people realized because the substance has a sweet taste that attracts animals. The next few hours passed in a horrible blur of phone calls, arrangements, and procedures that I never imagined I would have to deal with. Dr. Reeves took samples for testing to confirm the cause of death, though she said she was already certain about what they would find. I had to call the non-emergency police line to report a suspected poisoning, and an officer came to take a report and photographs of the scene. Officer Janet Martinez was kind and professional, but she explained that without evidence of who might have done this intentionally, there wasn't much the police could do beyond documenting the incident. "Unfortunately," she said, "pets get into antifreeze accidentally all the time. Unless you have reason to believe someone deliberately poisoned your dog, and evidence to support that belief, this will be classified as an accidental death." The word accidental made my blood boil because I knew in my heart that this was no accident. Copper had lived in this yard for over a year without any problems, and he wasn't the type of dog to eat random substances he found on the ground. Someone had done this deliberately, and I was almost certain I knew who. That evening, I sat in my backyard trying to piece together what might have happened. I examined every inch of the fence line, looking for any sign of how poison might have gotten into my yard. Near the back corner, close to where Copper had been found, I discovered something that made my heart race. Small blue stains on the ground that looked like they had dripped through a gap in the fence boards. Antifreeze is typically blue or green, and these stains were in a location that would be easily accessible from Vincent's side of the fence. I took pictures with my phone, documenting everything I could see, but I knew that stains on the ground wouldn't be enough to prove anything to the police. I needed more evidence, something that would definitively show what had happened and who was responsible. As I sat there in the growing darkness, staring at the fence that separated my property from Vincent's, I felt a cold rage building inside me unlike anything I had ever experienced before. This wasn't just about losing my beloved pet. This was about someone deliberately targeting an innocent animal because of their own twisted need for control. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. 3 months earlier, I had installed a small security camera system to capture time-lapse videos of my seasonal garden changes for my business portfolio. The cameras were discreet and designed to document plant growth over time, but they also captured any activity in my backyard around the clock. I had completely forgotten about them in the trauma of finding Copper, but now I realized they might hold the answers I desperately needed. With shaking hands, I downloaded the footage from October 15th and started scanning through the early morning hours when I had been at work. For the first 2 hours, everything looked normal: Copper napping, wandering around, drinking from his water bowl. Then, at 10:47 Yasa, I saw something that made me feel sick to my stomach. A hand appeared through the gap in the fence, holding what looked like a small bowl or container. The hand carefully placed the container on the ground just inside my yard, exactly where I had found the blue stains. 23 minutes later, the same hand reached through and retrieved the empty container. I watched the footage over and over, zooming in as much as the video quality would allow, and there was no question about what I was seeing. Someone had deliberately placed poisoned bait in my yard, waited for Copper to consume it, and then removed the evidence. The timestamp showed that this happened during the exact window when I was away at my client consultation, which meant that whoever did this had been watching my schedule and planning this attack. I saved copies of the video to multiple devices and storage locations, then sat back to consider my options. I could take this evidence to the police, but I knew that a partially visible hand in a grainy video might not be enough for criminal charges. I could confront Vincent directly, but that would only tip him off that I had evidence and give him a chance to cover his tracks. Or I could take a different approach entirely, one that would ensure justice was served in a way that the legal system might not be able to provide. As I stared at that terrible footage for the 100th time, watching the moment when someone signed my dog's death warrant, I felt something dark and determined settling into my heart. Chapter 3. The Perfect Plan. The next 2 weeks were the darkest period of my life. My house felt empty and wrong without Copper's presence, and every routine reminded me of what I had lost. His food bowls still sat in the kitchen corner. His favorite tennis ball remained where he had left it by the back door, and I couldn't bring myself to remove his bed from beside mine. Sleep became almost impossible because I kept listening for the sound of his breathing or the gentle tapping of his nails on the hardwood floors. During the day, I threw myself into work with desperate intensity, accepting every project and consultation that came my way because staying busy was the only thing that kept the grief from completely overwhelming me. But underneath the sadness, something else was growing. A cold, calculating anger that became stronger with each passing day. I had always been someone who believed in justice, in doing the right thing, in working within the system to solve problems. But the system had failed me, and Vincent had taken something precious from me that could never be replaced. It was time to take matters into my own hands. My expertise in botanical chemistry became the foundation for everything that followed. Most people don't realize that landscaping involves a deep understanding of plant biology, soil chemistry, and the complex interactions between different species and environmental factors. Over 15 years in the business, I had studied everything from beneficial mycorrhizal fungi to natural pest deterrents, from pH balance management to the precise chemical compositions that make certain plants thrive or fail. I knew which compounds could encourage rapid growth and which could inhibit it, which substances attracted beneficial insects and which repelled harmful ones. More importantly, for my current purposes, I knew exactly how different plant extracts affected human skin and respiratory systems, because safety was always a primary concern when working with clients who might have allergies or sensitivities. Vincent had made a fatal error in targeting someone with my particular set of knowledge and skills. He had no idea that his perfect lawn was about to become the battlefield for a war he could never win. The plan that emerged over those 2 weeks was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential effectiveness. Vincent's obsession with his perfect lawn meant that he handled every aspect of its care personally: watering, fertilizing, seeding, and maintenance. His irrigation system was a sophisticated setup with multiple zones, automated timers, and precision sprinkler heads that he had installed himself with characteristic attention to detail. I had observed him working on the system many times, often spending hours adjusting and readjusting various components to achieve optimal coverage patterns. The system drew water from the municipal supply through a main line that fed into a distribution manifold located in a utility box near his back porch. That utility box was the key to everything, because it would allow me to introduce my special preparation directly into the water supply that fed his precious grass. Vincent would literally be watering his lawn with a solution that would cause him significant discomfort, and he would have no idea what was happening until it was far too late to prevent the consequences. The active ingredient for my revenge would be concentrated extract from poison ivy, specifically the urushiol oil that causes severe allergic reactions in approximately 85% of the population. However, I wasn't planning to use poison ivy directly, because that would be too obvious and potentially traceable back to me. Instead, I would use a much more sophisticated approach involving Virginia creeper, a plant that produces similar irritating compounds, but is commonly used in landscaping and wouldn't raise suspicions if found in a garden supply store purchase. Through a process involving alcohol extraction and careful concentration, I could create a solution that would be essentially invisible when added to irrigation water, but would become highly potent when it came into contact with skin or was inhaled as vapor during hot weather. The beauty of this approach was that Vincent would be exposed to increasing doses over time through normal lawn maintenance activities, and the effects would build gradually until they became impossible to ignore. By the time he realized something was wrong, weeks of exposure would have primed his system for a massive allergic response. The timing would be critical to maximize both the physical impact and the psychological devastation. Vincent was scheduled to compete in the annual Highlands Ranch Garden Excellence Competition on November 12th, an event he had dominated for the past 5 years and clearly considered one of his most important annual achievements. I had seen him preparing for months, measuring and documenting every aspect of his lawn's condition, adjusting his care routine to ensure peak appearance for the judging date. The competition was a big deal in our community, with professional judges, media coverage, and substantial prize money for the winners. More importantly for Vincent, it was a public validation of his superiority and control, a chance to prove that his methods and dedication made him better than everyone else in the neighborhood. If I timed my intervention correctly, his perfect lawn would become a source of public humiliation rather than pride, and his physical condition would make it impossible for him to hide what was happening. The man who had killed my dog because of a few morning barks was about to discover what real disruption looked like. My preparation began with seemingly innocent visits to garden centers throughout the Denver metro area, purchasing Virginia creeper plants and various extraction supplies from different locations to avoid creating any suspicious patterns. I told clerks that I was experimenting with natural pest deterrents for a large commercial project, which was technically true even if the pest in question was Vincent rather than insects. In my home workshop, I began the careful process of creating my concentrated extract, using techniques I had learned years earlier during my Master Gardener certification program. The process took several days and required precise temperature control and timing, but the result was a clear, odorless liquid that would be virtually undetectable when diluted in irrigation water. I tested small amounts on my own skin to ensure potency, using areas that could be easily covered if any reaction occurred. The extract was definitely effective. Even minimal contact produced noticeable irritation within hours and significant inflammation within 24 hours. The night of October 30th, exactly 2 weeks after Copper's death, I put my plan into action. Vincent's house was dark and his car was gone, which meant he was following his usual Tuesday evening routine of dinner with his elderly mother across town. I knew from months of inadvertent observation that he would be gone for at least 3 hours, giving me plenty of time to work without interruption. Dressed in dark clothing and carrying a small backpack with my supplies, I made my way to the fence line and carefully removed 2 loose boards that I had identified during my surveillance. Vincent's backyard was eerily perfect in the moonlight, every line and angle precisely maintained, every surface clean and organized. His irrigation control box was exactly where I expected it to be, and the lock was a simple combination model that took me less than 5 minutes to bypass using techniques I had learned from YouTube videos. Once inside the system, I located the main water intake line and carefully installed a small injection port that would allow me to introduce my extract directly into the water supply. The modification was virtually invisible and would remain functional for weeks without any sign of tampering. Chapter 4. Justice Delivered. The first signs of success appeared exactly 6 days after I had modified Vincent's irrigation system. I was working in my front garden when I noticed him examining his lawn with obvious confusion, walking back and forth across the grass and stopping frequently to kneel down and inspect specific areas. His usual confident demeanor was replaced by something that looked almost like panic as he discovered small brown patches that had appeared seemingly overnight. Over the next few days, I watched through my kitchen window as Vincent's routine became increasingly frantic. He was outside for hours every morning and evening, testing his soil, adjusting his sprinkler heads, and applying various treatments that seemed to have no effect on the mysterious deterioration of his perfect grass. What he didn't realize was that every treatment he applied, every moment he spent kneeling on his lawn, every drop of irrigation water that splashed onto his skin was delivering another dose of my carefully prepared extract. His obsessive hands-on approach to lawn care was ensuring maximum exposure to the very substance that would soon make his life unbearable. By November 5th, just 1 week before the garden competition, Vincent's physical condition had deteriorated dramatically. The first obvious symptom was a severe rash that appeared on his hands and forearms, exactly the areas that would have the most contact with contaminated irrigation water and grass. I observed him examining his skin with growing alarm, clearly unable to understand why his body was suddenly rebelling against activities he had performed safely for years. The rash quickly spread to his face and neck, probably from touching contaminated areas and then inadvertently transferring the irritating compounds. Within 48 hours, the inflammation was so severe that his eyes were practically swollen shut, and angry red welts covered every exposed area of skin. He started wearing long sleeves and gloves while working on his lawn, but it was far too late to prevent the chemical reaction that was already cascading through his system. Every breath of vapor from his irrigation system was delivering more irritants directly to his respiratory tract, creating internal inflammation that no amount of protective clothing could prevent. The psychological impact was almost as devastating as the physical symptoms. Vincent's entire identity was built around control and perfection, and now both his body and his beloved lawn were betraying him in ways he couldn't understand or fix. I watched him make increasingly desperate attempts to save his grass, applying treatments that actually made the situation worse because they activated more of my extract and spread it to previously unaffected areas. His irrigation system, the pride of his property management arsenal, had become a delivery mechanism for his own destruction, and his compulsive lawn care routine was ensuring that the punishment continued to escalate with each passing day. The man who had been so concerned about a few dog barks disrupting his perfect environment was now creating real chaos as he stumbled around his yard at all hours, desperately trying to solve a problem he couldn't even identify. His neighbors started complaining about the noise he was making with his late-night lawn treatments, creating the very kind of disruption he had claimed to find so intolerable when it came from my innocent pet. November 10th brought the crisis I had been waiting for. Vincent's condition had become so severe that he was barely recognizable as the perfectly groomed man who had confronted me about Copper's barking. His face was grotesquely swollen, his skin was covered with oozing lesions, and he was clearly having difficulty breathing due to respiratory inflammation. When he collapsed on his lawn while attempting one final desperate treatment, his screams of pain and frustration were loud enough to bring several neighbors running to help. The paramedics who responded to the 911 call found him in a state of severe allergic distress, with symptoms that required immediate emergency intervention and transport to the hospital. As the ambulance pulled away, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and justice, knowing that Vincent was finally experiencing real suffering as a consequence of his cruel actions. The man who had killed my dog with poison was now poisoned himself, facing the same kind of helpless vulnerability that Copper had experienced in his final moments. The hospital investigation that followed was exactly what I had hoped for when I planned this intervention. When emergency room doctors examined Vincent's condition and medical history, they immediately suspected deliberate poisoning because the symptoms were far too severe and widespread to be accidental exposure. The pattern of inflammation, the respiratory complications, and the concentrated nature of the reaction all pointed to intentional contamination with plant-based irritants. Hospital security was contacted, and within hours, police detectives were interviewing Vincent about potential enemies, workplace conflicts, and neighborhood disputes that might have motivated someone to attack him. Of course, Vincent's first instinct was to blame me, claiming that I had poisoned him in retaliation for imaginary grievances related to my dog. But when detectives asked him to explain why he thought I might have a grudge against him, Vincent found himself in the impossible position of having to admit that he had been harassing me about normal pet behavior while concealing his own criminal actions. The detective assigned to Vincent's case was Officer Martinez, the same officer who had taken the report about Copper's death 3 weeks earlier. When she realized the connection between the two incidents, she became very interested in examining Vincent's claims more carefully. I had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, and when Officer Martinez contacted me for a follow-up interview, I had the perfect evidence ready to present. The security camera footage showing a hand placing poison bait in my yard was devastating proof that Vincent had committed a deliberate criminal act that resulted in Copper's death. Combined with the timeline of events, Vincent's documented complaints about my dog, and his suspicious eagerness to blame me for his own poisoning, the evidence painted a clear picture of a man who was facing justified consequences for his own cruel behavior. Officer Martinez immediately escalated the case to the detective division, and within 24 hours, Vincent was under investigation for animal cruelty, illegal use of poison, and property damage, charges that carried serious potential jail time and financial penalties. The garden competition on November 12th became the final humiliation that completed Vincent's public destruction. Even though he was still in the hospital, the judging proceeded as scheduled because competitors who failed to appear were automatically disqualified. I made sure to be working in my front yard when the judges arrived at Vincent's house, and I had a perfect view of their shocked reactions to what they found. His once perfect lawn was now a patchwork of dead grass, brown spots, and chemical burn marks from his increasingly desperate treatment attempts. The irrigation system was still running, spreading contaminated water across the ruined landscape, and the smell of failed treatments and dying vegetation was noticeable even from the street. The judges spent less than 5 minutes documenting the disaster before moving on to other properties, and I heard one of them comment that it was the worst lawn deterioration she had ever seen in 20 years of competition judging. Vincent's 5-year winning streak was over. His reputation in the community was destroyed, and his legal troubles were just beginning. The man who had needed absolute control over his environment had lost control of everything that mattered to him. Chapter 5. The Price of Justice. The weeks following Vincent's hospitalization brought a cascade of consequences that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations for justice. The criminal investigation moved quickly once Officer Martinez presented the security camera evidence to the district attorney's office. Vincent was formally charged with animal cruelty in the first degree, illegal distribution of poison, and criminal mischief, charges that carried a potential sentence of up to 3 years in prison and substantial financial penalties. His attempts to claim that he had been acting in self-defense against a nuisance animal only made his situation worse because they established clear premeditation and showed a complete lack of remorse for his actions. The local media picked up the story because animal cruelty cases always generated public interest, and Vincent's mugshot, showing his still swollen, rash-covered face, became a symbol of justified consequences throughout the Denver metro area. His employer, a conservative insurance company that prided itself on ethical behavior and community involvement, placed him on indefinite suspension pending the outcome of his trial. Vincent's medical recovery was slow and complicated by the fact that his massive exposure to concentrated plant irritants had sensitized his immune system in ways that would have lasting effects. Even after the initial inflammation subsided, he continued to experience severe reactions to common environmental triggers that had never bothered him before. His dermatologist explained that his skin would likely remain hypersensitive for years, making it impossible for him to engage in outdoor activities without extensive protective equipment and medications. The respiratory damage was even more serious, requiring ongoing treatment and significantly limiting his physical capabilities. The man who had taken such pride in his perfect lawn and meticulous outdoor maintenance would never again be able to work in his garden without risking serious health consequences. In a cruel irony that felt like perfect justice, Vincent's own obsession with environmental control had made him permanently vulnerable to the very environment he had tried so hard to dominate. The financial devastation was almost as severe as the legal and medical consequences. Vincent's medical bills from his emergency treatment and ongoing care quickly exceeded $50,000, most of which wasn't covered by his insurance because the poisoning was considered a criminal matter rather than a medical condition. His legal defense costs were mounting rapidly as he hired expensive attorneys to try to minimize his criminal exposure. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his chances of avoiding conviction were essentially zero. The civil lawsuit I filed against him for the emotional distress and veterinary costs related to Copper's death was proceeding on a parallel track, with my attorney confident that we could secure substantial damages given the clear evidence of Vincent's deliberate criminal actions. Most devastating of all, Vincent's insurance company denied coverage for any liability related to his intentional criminal acts, leaving him personally responsible for all financial consequences of his decision to poison my dog. But my own reckoning was also approaching, and I had always known that justice would require me to pay a price as well. The police investigation into Vincent's poisoning had been thorough and professional, and while I had been careful to avoid leaving obvious evidence, I hadn't been perfect. Traces of Virginia creeper extract were eventually found in Vincent's irrigation system, and botanical analysis showed that the concentration and preparation method indicated someone with advanced knowledge of plant chemistry. The list of people with both the expertise and the motive to carry out such a sophisticated attack was very short, and my name was at the top of that list. When Detective Sarah Chen knocked on my door on December 3rd, I was ready for her. I had consulted with a criminal defense attorney, prepared my statement, and accepted that accountability for my actions was the final step in this entire process. I wasn't proud of what I had done, but I also wasn't ashamed of seeking justice when the system had failed to protect an innocent creature. My confession was carefully worded to acknowledge responsibility while emphasizing the context that had driven me to take extreme action. I admitted to modifying Vincent's irrigation system and introducing plant-based irritants that caused his severe allergic reaction, but I also detailed the emotional devastation of losing Copper and the frustration of watching Vincent escape consequences for his deliberate cruelty. My attorney had negotiated a plea agreement that recognized the unique circumstances of the case. I would plead guilty to criminal mischief in the 3rd degree and assault in the 3rd degree, charges that carried potential jail time but were considered misdemeanors rather than felonies. In exchange for my cooperation and full disclosure of my methods, the prosecutor agreed to recommend probation, community service, and restitution rather than incarceration. I would have a criminal record and would face significant financial penalties, but I would avoid prison time and be able to continue working in my profession. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was fair given the gravity of my actions and the circumstances that had motivated them. The final chapter of this story played out in court on January 15th, when both Vincent and I appeared before Judge Margaret Sullivan for our respective sentencing hearings. Vincent went first, and despite his attorney's attempts to portray him as a victim of vigilante justice, the evidence of his premeditated cruelty toward an innocent animal was undeniable. Judge Sullivan sentenced him to 18 months in prison, 3 years probation, $25,000 in fines, and a lifetime ban from owning pets or living on property where pets were kept. His victim impact statement, in which he attempted to argue that my retaliation was disproportionate to his actions, only seemed to anger the judge further. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "you deliberately poisoned an innocent animal because you found its normal behavior inconvenient. The consequences you have faced are entirely the result of your own criminal choices." When my turn came, I read a statement acknowledging the injustice of my actions and explaining the emotional devastation that led me to seek unlawful justice outside the legal system. Judge Sullivan sentenced me to 2 years, probation, 200 hours of community service at the local animal shelter, and $5,000 in restitution to Vincent's medical fund, a sentence that seemed proportionate and fair. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and closure. Vincent would spend the next year and a half in prison, thinking about the consequences of targeting innocent creatures, while I would spend the next 2 years rebuilding my life and finding constructive ways to honor Copper's memory. I had learned that revenge, even justified revenge, comes with a price that must be paid by everyone involved. The justice system had ultimately worked, though not in the way I had initially expected, and both Vincent and I would carry the consequences of our choices for the rest of our lives. But as I drove home past the empty lot where Vincent's house now sat, foreclosed and demolished after he could no longer afford the payments, I felt that Copper's death had finally been answered with appropriate consequences. Sometimes justice requires us to step outside our comfort zones and accept the costs of our own actions, but that doesn't make it any less necessary or meaningful. My dog's killer had been punished. I had been held accountable for my response, and the world was a slightly more just place than it had been 6 months earlier.